guys, so today we will be discussing my digital citizenship artifact. I chose to create a board game. This board game is geared towards grades 6 through 8 on the topic of copyright and creative identity or creative creditability. So to start out the lesson plan, the children will be asked to assess their knowledge on copyright and trademark. Any questions they may have. Now this can be in the form of a list or like a T-chart. They will be asked to write down what they already know about copyright, whether it be what it means, maybe what copyright protects and things like that. And then on the other side, they will be asked to write down any questions or anything that they might think that they need a little bit more help on from the topic of copyright. So once the lists and T-charts are handed into the instructor, we will look over them and see, kind of gauge what each student and where they're starting out at, what they already know, and just go from there. So after the T-charts and the list are then assessed, the students will be shown 2 short instructional videos on copyright and creative credit. Once those videos are over, we'll give a quick introduction on how to play the board game. So the board game is just this poster board with spaces drawn out, kind of all wiggly and wobbly. There are a few pieces, character pieces, so the students will then split off into a couple groups, each composing of 2 to 3 students each, and they will decide what character they want to have represent them on the board. So there's like a guitar pick, there's a little spaceship, there's a feather, there's the letter Y, and then there's a flower. So these all kind of keep place of where each group is at on the board, and just lets them know like the ranking of their spots and how well they're doing and things like that. So once these groups and the characters are determined, the groups will then start to play a game of rock, paper, scissors. So this rock, paper, scissors is one of the introductions. They'll be given an option between how to start. They can either play rock, paper, scissors to determine who goes first, or they will be given a little bit more of a challenging start where I will think of a number and I will ask them to tell me a number. They will move the amount of spaces that is the sum of those numbers. So say for instance, I'm thinking of 2. If they say the number 6, they will move 4 spots. And this only goes for whoever the winner is of rock, paper, scissors. So once the teams are, battling it out over rock, paper, scissors, whoever the winner of that is then gets to move on to how many spaces they get to move. So it's not just if you win rock, paper, scissors, you only move 1 space. This is just to start out the game since there's no die or like a spinner involved showing, representing the amount of spaces you move. So once the first team is on the board, it then just goes clockwise around the room for who goes next. So each individual space is marked as to what card you get. So there's a guessing, there's true or false, and then there's copyright or not. There is also a penalty space on the board. If you land on a penalty space, you move back a spot. So there are 3 different decks of cards on the board. You will pick up whatever card from the top of the deck that you land on space-wise. So for example, if you land on copyright or not, you will pick up this card. You will read the question on the card or the example on the card. You will then discuss with your group what you think the answer is, whether it's copyright or it's not copyright. You will then tell me you have an answer. You tell me the answer, and there's a QR code that you scan on here that gives you the answer. So for example, this one says building a sculpture off of a photo with permission from a photographer. Is that copyright or not? So in order to get the answer, I pull up the QR scanner on my phone and I will go over the QR code and it pops up the answer. So this actually says not copyright. So that means that this example is not copyright. So whether or not they get that right, if they do, they will move this number down here that says 1 SP, that means 1 space. So they will move their character on the board 1 space forward. And whatever they land on will be what they go next. So this is just one of the examples of the cards there. Like I said, there are also true or false and then a guess. So in the instance of them not getting the question right, another team has an option to steal. If the first person, if I announce that they did not get the question right, the first person or the first group who raises their hand to take a chance at the question will be the first to go. So they can go ahead and get the card, they'll read the card, they'll scan the QR code and see if they got it right. If they got it right, they will get to move forward the 1 space and keep the card. So you keep these cards if you get them right, and at the end they will be awarded a piece of candy if they got the most points or the most cards. So once the game starts going, they then start choosing the cards. Whoever makes it to the finish line first gets candy, they win. Whoever, if it's not the same group, whoever has the most cards, which signifies how many questions they've gotten right, they get a piece of candy. So I'll go over a couple more cards. So this one is true or false. The question is, names can be protected under copyright. So it's asking whether the names can or cannot be protected under copyright. So right now, I will go ahead and just scan the code. And right off the bat, it's telling me false. So names are not protected under copyright. And down at the bottom, it says on here, they can move 2 spaces if they get it right. And then these guessing ones are just examples. This is where the art aspect comes into play. So on the guess cards, there will either be examples of quotes that famous people have said. They will have to guess who said it. There are some that show pictures of paintings or photographs or drawings. They will have to either guess the name of it or the artist to get it right. And a name is worth so many spaces, and then the artist is worth so many spaces. So if they get both of those right, they get to move both of the amount of spaces. If they only get one right, they get to only move that 1 space. If they don't get any right, the stealing is up for grabs. So for this one, for the guess one, it says, "Who said I have a dream?" So, the famous MLK quote. So they scan the code, and up pops up Martin Luther King Jr. So this card was worth 1 space. So they will move 1 space forward. Now, that is the breakdown of how to play the game. Once the game is done, they'll be given time to clean up and kind of regroup into a class and settle down. They will be given a short quiz at the end to kind of assess their knowledge over copyright and what they've learned just by listening to other people answer questions from the video, just examples that they've seen throughout the game. And it's only 5 questions. They're all worth 1 point each. So once they're done with the quiz, they'll hand them in. They'll be assessed whether or not they pass or fail on how well they answer the questions. And then after the quiz, they will move on to the illustration portion, which is the last portion of the lesson. They're given a piece of paper. They can either make a comic strip or an illustration, just a big, fill up the whole paper, about a real life scenario of copyright. So it might be an example of, a robber stealing the Mona Lisa and recreating it and selling it to someone else. That could be an example of what they would draw, or like how to avoid copyright and things like that. And then that also brings another play of art into it, because they would have learned about elements of design, so like using shapes and colors and lines in respect to each other. So that will be assessed as well. How much detail they put into it or effort they put into it, if it was messy or rushed or things like that, if they used a good range of colors, if it was, a good illustration depicting, the realness of the topic and the understanding. And that is how we wrap up the lesson plan. So once that comic strip and those illustrations are turned in and assessed, the lesson plan is officially over. And this kind of gives a basis on what they understand on copyright, as well as some movements and famous people over things like what they said, what they made, and any examples of, copyright infringement. There are a few questions in there that deal with violating copyright in the board game, so they'll be able to understand and realize how they're in violation of copyright, or how they can avoid it by realizing what are violations. So I think this is a great way to kind of keep the interest of middle schoolers. I mean, copyright isn't a great subject that many people like to listen to. I know I personally would not want to sit in a class for an hour and listen to someone talk about copyright and how to avoid it and things like that. So I feel like this board game definitely aims to intertwine both the art aspect of the class as well as something like copyright, which is very heavily introduced into the art world. So it's a great way to kind of intertwine the two, and it's a great way to also not only gauge the understanding but keep the interest of the students. This board game can, in different scenarios, can probably get out of hand if they're a little too competitive, or if they're not really following along or participating very well, but I feel like overall this would be a good interest keeper and a good way to provide a lesson on two completely different topics and combine them into one. So I hope you enjoyed, and I really hope you enjoy the game, and have a good day.